Hi, I'm Jeanette Roche. This is Bridge City News. Here are some of the top stories we've been following. Freedom Convoy organizer Pat King sentenced to 3 months house arrest. Plus, Alberta's Premier and Health Minister respond to the lawsuit and controversy over private surgical contracts. And Canadian investigators recovered the black box of the Delta plane that crashed in Toronto.
Your nation. Your province. Your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Jeanette Roche.
Thanks so much for joining us. Freedom Convoy organizer Pat King of Alberta heard his sentence today. He has been handed 3 months house arrest and includes 100 hours of community service at a food bank or men's shelter. It comes on top of the 9 months he served before and during his trial. King was found guilty on 5 charges for his role in the 2022 protest that took over downtown Ottawa for several weeks. Justice Charles Hackland says King is to remain in his home, not return to Ottawa except for court appearances, and to stay away from other convoy leaders. The Crown recommended to Justice Hackland that King be given 10 years in prison, the maximum sentence for mischief. Of the 21 injured passengers involved in Monday's plane crash at Toronto Pearson's Airport, 20 have been released from hospital. Delta Airlines gave the update today as investigators work to determine what caused a regional flight from Minneapolis to crash upon landing at the airport on Monday and flip over onto its roof on the tarmac. The black box has been recovered and Canadian authorities have sent it off for analysis. All 80 people on board the plane survived. Meanwhile, it's been an unsettling and very sad month for air travel. 2 people were killed today after 2 fixed-wing single-engine planes collided in midair outside of Tucson, Arizona. It's the second incident in Arizona this month. On February 10th, 2 private jets collided at Scottsdale Airport, killing 1 person and injuring 4. Prior to that, on February 6th, a small plane carrying 10 people crashed in Alaska after losing speed and altitude and vanishing from the radar. On January 31st, in Philadelphia, a medical transport plane crashed in a residential area northeast of Philadelphia, leaving 6 people on the plane and 1 person on the ground dead. And just 2 days prior to that, 67 people were killed when an American Airlines plane collided with a military Black Hawk helicopter while on final approach into Washington, D.C. National Airport. Both the chopper and the plane ended up in the Potomac River. Today, for the first time, the Alberta government publicly addressed a lawsuit and allegations against them concerning high-level corruption surrounding medical contracts. In response, Premier Danielle Smith says she's making some changes by appointing Darren Headley as Alberta's Deputy Minister of Health. Andre Tremblay will continue as the interim CEO and official administrator of Alberta Health Services. This comes on the heels of former AHS CEO Anthony Mentzelopoulos' allegations of sketchy deals pushed by Alberta officials.
To deal with surgical backlogs, Alberta Health Services followed the strategic direction provided by previous governments, signed contracts with charter surgical facilities to help alleviate pressure on our health system and increase capacity. And because it has worked, we tried to expand these centres through new competitive bid processes. In terms of the latest RFP process for new facilities, the former CEO of Alberta Health Services made some very troubling allegations, and those allegations are serious and they are being investigated. We have asked the Auditor General to expedite his review so that we can have answers as soon as possible.
Last week, the former CEO of AHS filed a statement of claim. Upon review, the allegations and claims that have been made against me are false, while others will have to be investigated further as part of the Auditor General's work and the government's external third-party investigation that is being set up by Deputy Minister McPherson. We will be filing our statement of defence in the coming weeks and will be vigorously, and I mean vigorously, defending against this claim.
In her defense, Mentzelopoulos made close to 77 claims in her statement of facts. She is seeking compensation in the amount of $1.7 million. On January 8th, she was stripped of her role via a Zoom call, and she is suing the province for wrongful dismissal, claiming she was let go for investigating overpriced contracts. Meanwhile, Alberta's opposition NDP has been very vocal about the issue, even calling the alleged scandal corrupt care. Edmonton Glenora MLA Sarah Hoffman is the Shadow Minister for Health. She is calling on the province to put a stop to privatized healthcare.
The severity of these allegations of corruption and interference when dealing with surgical contracts in our healthcare system is a major concern for Albertans, especially for those who are still waiting for surgeries. We know that our public healthcare needs investment. And when Danielle Smith was running for leader, she promised that she'd fix healthcare in 90 days. Well, she's been premier for 852, and she's only made it worse. Next week, the legislature will finally return, and the UCP will have to table a budget. Albertans deserve a meaningful investment in public health care. But what we've seen under the UCP is a desire to Americanize and privatize our healthcare system. Let's be clear, nobody wants this privatization of our healthcare system.
According to Hoffman, these private surgical center contracts are set to expire April 30th. The province will be releasing their budget next week, but will we see a surplus or a deficit? Tyler Dawson, legislative correspondent for the National Post, weighs in.
The last budget update, I think they'd forecast about a $4.5 billion surplus, which, I mean, that's an unbelievable amount of money if it was in either of our pockets, but it's not really that much money from a government budgeting perspective. And so it's not totally clear if that surplus will have vanished, if it'll have shrunk. And, you know, the annual budget making process is generally made challenging by oil prices. If oil prices are really good, there's a lot of money coming in from resource royalties that can then be, you know, spent on various things. If it's been a bad year for oil prices, then the province tends to head towards a deficit. So that's sort of the open question here right now is what has the price of oil been doing for the past year, and how is that going to sort of be reflected in the budget?
Catch my full interview with Tyler Dawson, the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, coming up later in the show. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is speaking with European leaders today to address comments from U.S. President Donald Trump that suggest Ukraine started the war with Russia. Government officials from the U.S. and Russia met in Saudi Arabia to discuss ending the war with Ukraine, but Ukraine did not have a seat at the table. Trudeau says Ukraine must have that seat at the table in any peace talks as Washington and Moscow discuss ways to end the war. He adds that democracy is at risk if more countries are allowed to invade their neighbors. In fact, President Donald Trump has called Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky a, quote, dictator without elections. Foreign Affairs correspondent Lisa Daftari explains what Trump's tactics might mean.
Kind of. He's bullying his way to a ceasefire. He's basically telling Zelensky, this is what I think of you. You know, you've basically power grabbed your way, you know, to be where you are, which is ironic given the fact that we're dealing with Putin on the other side. But, you know, he's basically saying, look, you know, I'm going to belittle you in order to get, you know, you to come around and not really play me like a fiddle the way you did the Biden administration.
Lisa also discusses Canada-U.S. relations and the current trade war. You can catch that full interview coming up later on in the program. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a video message Wednesday, a day before Hamas is expected to release the bodies of 4 hostages, including a mother and her 2 children, who have long been feared dead. In this video, Netanyahu says, quote, the heart of the whole world needs to break because here we see who we are dealing with, monsters, end quote. Canada's military leaders say the number of those recruited to our armed forces is encouraging. General Jenny Kerrigan, chief of the Defense Staff, says the Canadian Armed Forces recruitment numbers have stabilized, and she's cautiously optimistic the military will be back to full strength by 2029.
Last year, the situation had stabilized for the first time, so the downward trend was stopped last year. So last year we finished around 250 over. That's including the attrition numbers. So this year, again, we are very encouraged by the results. So as of today, we are 1,300 over and above. So that's a net increase of 1,300 up to date. But by the end of March, the numbers will even be better.
Around 500,000 vaccines have been ordered by the Public Health Agency of Canada for potential bird flu threats. Ottawa says the shot is meant for people who may be at increased risk, such as those who have had ongoing contact with infected animals and their environments. They also say the risk to the general public is low. Back here in Alberta, the union representing custodians and maintenance workers at 2 Calgary school boards will serve a 72-hour strike notice. Roughly 800 workers from the Calgary Board of Education and 350 employees from the Calgary Catholic School District could hit picket lines on Monday morning. The Canadian Union of Public Employees says events at schools this weekend could be impacted. They join more than 4,000 staff already on strike in Edmonton, Fort McMurray, and Parkland County over a wage dispute with their employers. Lethbridge police on Wednesday said they have charged a 66-year-old man of sexual assault of an 11-year-old boy. Police responded to a report on February 10th at Stan Seawick Pool, where it was determined that the man approached the child in the men's change room and sexually assaulted him there. The man, Kwan Phuoc Tran of Lethbridge, was arrested the next day on the 11th without incident. Tran is charged with sexual assault and sexual interference. He's been released from custody with conditions prohibiting him from accessing Stan Seawick Pool and other public pools, parks, schools, playgrounds, and community centers where persons under 18 may be present. He is scheduled to appear in court on March the 25th. LPS say that after further investigation, there may be additional victims, and they're asking any unidentified victims to contact police at the number on your screen. Lethbridge police also have identified a man in connection with fraud. The man, who has not been publicly revealed, reportedly defrauded a local bank by opening an account, depositing a fraudulent check, and later withdrawing the funds. More fraudulent activity connected to the account occurred in Lethbridge and Calgary, and the man reportedly has ties to Vancouver. Police say the investigation is still ongoing. There have been, sadly, multiple reports across Canada this week of deaths caused by carbon monoxide poisoning. The cold weather often can lead to incidents where people find themselves in danger of the so-called silent killer in attempting to warm their homes, vehicles, and other shelters. BCN's Landon Hickok has more details on some of those stories.
Thanks, Jeanette. There have been no shortage of calls of carbon monoxide poisoning and incidents across Canada, especially with extreme cold in the west and heavy snowfall in the east. In one instance, Northern Alberta RCMP responded to a call that 2 men were found dead in an ice fishing tent at Crow Lake Provincial Park. Investigations found that emissions from a nearby heating source was to blame for the carbon monoxide poisoning.
Carbon monoxide, actually how it's created is it's fuels not being burned completely. So it could be anything from natural gas to gasoline to wood, things like that. If it's not working, the devices are not working completely, the fuel is not burned completely, and that's what causes the carbon monoxide.
In Calgary, police say that 1 woman has died and a child was admitted to the hospital after crews were called to a Southwest home on Tuesday. It was determined that carbon monoxide leaked from a furnace in the home and that no carbon monoxide alarms were installed in the house. The child remains in stable condition.
If you start to feel very lightheaded, you can get headaches, you can get blurred vision, things like that. You just don't feel well. Don't take it as just, I'm just having a bad day and I'm not feeling well. If it's the risk there, you need to get to some fresh air and you need to go get some assistance for that, because that is some of the symptoms you will feel, is an awful lot of just not feeling well, dizziness, upset stomach, and blurred vision for sure.
And in Montreal this week, a man was found unresponsive in his vehicle that was heavily covered in snow and with the engine still running. Emergency crews found the 57-year-old man at the time under cardiac arrest, but was pronounced dead later at the hospital. Investigators say that snow was blocking the exhaust pipe. That was to blame for the carbon monoxide poisoning, which was very likely a factor in his death. Now in Lethbridge, we haven't had many known reports of carbon monoxide incidents over this recent cold snap, but Lethbridge Fire and Emergency Services are vocal on carbon monoxide awareness, and I previously told BCN measures that people can take to ensure another tragic event does not occur here.
Eliminating a lot of the things that will cause carbon monoxide, which for example could be maybe faulty equipment, so it's a good idea to get people to come in and test your equipment annually just to make sure everything's working well, like your gas fireplace, your gas furnace, stoves, anything like that. You want to make sure that you're not running vehicles too close to air intakes or inside your garage.
Chief Fire Marshal Hicks is also additionally adamant that carbon monoxide detectors are paramount to that of smoke detectors, and one should install in every level of their home or business. Jeanette?
Thank you, Landon. Well, 5 women from our community have excelled in their community work and are the recipients of the YWCA Lethbridge 2025 Women of Distinction Award. Lorianne Johansson, YWCA Events, Marketing and Communications Manager, says a life lived with passion, hard work, and dedication is part of what makes these women stand out. Johansson tells us who they are.
Wonderful opportunity to celebrate and recognize incredible women of any age in our community that are making positive impacts. Dr. Carly Adams, a Board of Governors Research Chair and a Professor of Kinesiology and Physical Education at the University of Lethbridge. Maral Kiani-Tari is currently serving as the Executive Director of the Family Center Society of Southern Alberta. Dr. Saye Zelke is serving as a Vice Board Member for the Alberta Health Services Board. Anna Campmans, she is currently the president of the CCH Student Council. Dr. Bev Mundell-Atherston is actively involved in SACPA here in Lethbridge. Our Women of Distinction Awards dinner will be held on International Women's Day at the Coast Hotel Grand Ballroom.
The event will start at 7 p.m. on Saturday, March the 8th, and tickets can be found at ywcalethbridge.com. Beyond Remembrance Day, we must remember our veterans throughout the year. That is why the Veterans Association Food Bank Lethbridge, Alberta invites the community to join the Regift Your Gift Cards campaign as a simple yet meaningful way to show your appreciation. Lee Willoughby, the charity's operations coordinator, explains what this initiative consists of.
We could use those gift cards in a couple ways. We could use them and go get the core of the stuff we need here for our bank, or we can put them in hampers that we send out every month to our clients. And you usually put in about $200 worth of Walmart gift cards. So that would augment these cards here, and it would be substantial. We're starting to have more and more veterans that require help since we've opened last year, and we've noticed that still we have people that do not know we're here. And these gift cards are for anything that they need. They can get groceries, they can get personal items, they can get everything they actually need there with these cards.
Willoughby is inviting the community to donate gift cards and drop them off at the Veterans Association Food Bank at 242 12B Street, North Lethbridge. Well, it looks like this polar vortex is about to end. I'll be right back with a full look at weather next. Well, we are looking at an overnight low of -13, which puts us almost back into seasonal range, which is so much better than the temperatures that we have been seeing lately. And that is just going to keep climbing and climbing, because look at the week ahead of us. So Thursday, we're climbing up to 5 degrees, which puts us now above seasonal. And then we're going to stick at that 5 degrees on Friday. Clear skies. Look at that beautiful sunshine all through the weekend there. High of 8 degrees on Saturday. And this Sunday, looking at some double digits. 10 degrees for the high there on Sunday, up to 12 on Monday, and then back to 10 degrees on Tuesday. So that's well above average for this time of year, because look at this, average high is 3, not 10, 3. We're going to be at 10 soon. I can't wait for that. Average low -10, 18 was the record high on this day back in 1916. And in 1986, Lethbridge saw its record cold, which was -39. Sun rose this morning at 7:34 a.m. and our sun set this evening at 5:57. So now we're seeing 10 hours, 10 minutes of daylight. tonight, which puts us 4 minutes more daylight today than we saw yesterday. Okay, a little bit of a rainy one on the west coast tomorrow. Victoria sitting at 10 degrees. Could see a 30% chance of showers in Vancouver, 9 for the high there, 2 degrees in Edmonton, and 5 in Calgary under clear, beautiful skies. Now, we were still sitting under that extreme cold warning for Saskatchewan and Manitoba, but things should start to moderate by Thursday. Minus 12, that's much better there for Saskatoon tomorrow. Minus 15 in Regina and minus 14 in Winnipeg. Clear skies all the way around. A little bit of precipitation as we get into central Canada here. Toronto seeing a 30% chance of flurries and then switching to 70% chance of light snow by the afternoon, minus 7 for the high. Minus 7 also in Ottawa with periods of light snow, a 40% chance of flurries expected tomorrow in Montreal with a high of minus 6. As we look over into Atlantic Canada, Fredericton's high tomorrow minus 1 with a mix of sun and cloud. Also in Halifax, high of 0, minus 1 in Charlottetown, 0 again in St. John's with up to 60 km/h winds and a mix of sun and cloud there. So there you have it. That is your forecast. Loblaw has announced a new $10 billion investment over the next 5 years, which includes plans to open 80 new grocery and pharmacy stores this year. Loblaw says about 50 of the new stores will be discount grocers. Here's Michelle Zadikian of the Canadian Press with more.
Retail expert Bruce Winder says Loblaw is reading the room. Shoppers have been hungry for grocery deals and discounts as inflation and high interest rates take a toll on household budgets. It has many consumers flocking to discount grocery stores. Loblaw, along with Metro and Sobeys parent Empire, have noticed sales at their discount brands have outpaced those at their traditional stores. So they've taken to opening more discount banners like No Frills, Freshco, and Food Basics. They've also been converting existing stores into discount brands. While inflation has eased, Winder says he thinks the deal hunting trend is here to stay and could even continue growing.
Canadian Tire is selling its Helly Hansen brand to a U.S. owner for close to $1.3 billion. The sportswear line will wind up in the hands of Contour Brands, which also owns Wrangler, Lee, as well as Rock and Republic. Canadian Tire says the sale is a way to increase its focus on its Canadian retail portfolio. The multi-year supply deal will allow Canadian Tire and its brands to continue to sell Helly Hansen products. Software developers are creating apps to try to make it easier for consumers to tell how Canadian a product is. MapleScan tells the user where a product's manufacturer is based and whether the item is considered a product of Canada or made in Canada. Meanwhile, the Buy Beaver app relies on crowdsourcing to rank products' manufacturing location, materials and ingredients, and brand ownership. Multiple apps have been popping up after the U.S. began threatening hefty tariffs on Canadian goods. Now here's a look at today's markets.
The TSX was down 22 basis points to 25,626. The Dow was up 71 points to 44,627. The S&P 500 was up 14 points to 6,144, and the Nasdaq was also up 14 points to 20,056. West Texas Intermediate oil was up 40 cents to $72.25 US per barrel. Natural gas was up 37 cents to $4.39 US. Gold was down 105 to $29.3277 US an ounce, and silver was down 20 cents to $32.70 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $8.65 per bushel, barley is at $6.58, canola is at $15.10, and corn is at $8.56 per bushel. Live cattle were up 38 cents to $197.83. Feeder cattle March contract was down 70 cents to $269.03, and lean hogs April contract was down $3.45 to $89.75. And the Canadian dollar was down slightly over the past 24 hours and currently sits at 70.20 US.
Recapping one of our top stories, Freedom Convoy organizer Pat King of Alberta heard his sentence today. He's been handed 3 months house arrest and includes 100 hours of community service at a food bank or men's shelter. It comes on top of the 9 months he served before and during his trial. King was found guilty on 5 charges for his role in the 2022 protest that took over downtown Ottawa for several weeks. Justice Charles Hackland says King is to remain in his home, not return to Ottawa except for court appearances, and stay away from other convoy leaders. Coming up after the break, we'll be hearing from legislative reporter Tyler Dawson, who will weigh in on the province releasing their budget next week. Will we see a surplus or a deficit? Well, Tyler will weigh in on that. Also, when you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. You can also visit our website or our YouTube page anytime to check out more of our stories and interviews. The Alberta budget will be released next week, while the province simultaneously finds itself in the midst of a controversy with Alberta Health Services, plus differing opinions about the Premier's trips to Washington, D.C. And here to discuss all of this and a whole lot more is a legislative correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, welcome. Welcome back. Thanks for joining me again today.
Always happy to be here.
Wonderful. Okay, the government of Alberta is finding themselves embroiled in a major controversy over contracting at Alberta Health Services. And the short version is that the former head of AHS has sued the government, alleging that she was fired from her job as she was about to report on serious misconduct during the contracting process for private surgical facilities. So since then, Premier Danielle Smith has stood by Alberta Health Minister Adriana LaGrange and ordered a full investigation. But there are some cracks showing in cabinet. So Tyler, what are these cracks?
Well, the main crack that's showing is that Peter Guthrie, who's the infrastructure minister, reportedly wrote to his cabinet colleagues last week and said that LaGrange, the health minister, should step aside for the duration of any investigation into what's going on here. So there's some sign that internally the government is a little bit sort of rattled by this. As you'd sort of alluded to, it is rather complicated. The gist of it basically being that it's alleged that there was pressure put on Alberta Health Services to sign contracts for private surgical facilities, the private facilities publicly funded, and that there was pressure to sort of pay above market rates basically for these contracts. And so that's sort of the beginning allegation, and everything else sort of stems from there. Where was the pressure coming from? Who was involved? Who may have been benefiting from this sort of thing? And then, of course, the head of AHS went to the board of AHS. They said to take the information to the RCMP, according to the statement of claim filed in court here. And then the board and the head of AHS were all fired. So it's a really messy, complicated scandal. The information is coming out, primarily through the news, primarily very slowly, as reporters sort of get drips and drabs of information here and there. But it's certainly been a major story the last couple of weeks in Alberta, and it's linked, of course, to this much longer running drama over the $70 million for Turkish pain medication. So there's a lot going on here, and as I've alluded to, really complicated. But certainly, it is one of the first big scandal maybe of Premier Danielle Smith's time in office, and so it's been interesting to see how they're navigating all of this.
Yeah, exactly. Some people are saying it's the biggest scandal ever in Alberta's, political history.
Well,
Danielle Smith saying that she knew nothing about it and she read about it in the newspaper. So yeah.
I mean, we've had some good political scandals over the years. I mean, it could end up being the biggest scandal, but I mean, the Sky Palace was a rather big one too. The fraudulent manifests on flights and all that sort of thing. We've got our we punch above our weight perhaps when it comes to dramatic political scandals.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on here. Next Thursday, Tyler, marks the release of the provincial budget. The province had hoped for a modest surplus going into 2025, but it's unclear right now if next week's budget will be a deficit or a surplus. So Tyler, what do you think? What are some of the indicators that we could see it going either way?
Yeah, so the last budget update, I think they'd forecast about a $4.5 billion surplus, which, I mean, that's an unbelievable amount of money if it was in either of our pockets, but it's not really that much money from a government budgeting perspective. And so it's not totally clear if that surplus will have vanished, if it'll have shrunk. And, you know, the annual budget making process is generally made challenging by oil prices. If oil prices are really good, there's a lot of money coming in from resource royalties that can then be, you know, spent on various things. If it's been a bad year for oil prices, then the province tends to head towards a deficit. So that's sort of the open question here right now is what has the price of oil been doing for the past year, and how is that going to sort of be reflected in the budget. Now, so I would suspect either a modest deficit or a modest surplus. I don't think we're going to see a colossal deficit. I don't think we're going to see a huge surplus. It'll probably be a pretty steady as she goes kind of budget would be my hunch on it. And we won't, I think, see the tax cut. You know, in 2023, Premier Danielle Smith, well, she wasn't Premier at the time, but in the election when she was leading the UCP, she promised an income tax cut for Albertans. It'd be about, I think, $750 per person per year. That I don't think we're going to see. I mean, the budget is probably just too tight to reduce the government revenues from income tax, because of course resource revenues, it's a lot of money, but the bulk of the money the Alberta government brings in is still coming from the pockets of individual taxpayers. So those would be my hunches. You know, we've seen a few other glimmers of what's going to be in there, some sort of school construction kind of stuff in Edmonton and Calgary in particular, but not a whole lot of hints just yet. You know, I think we might see some more reporting on that, some more leaks, things like that over the course of next week before Thursday. But I don't expect any real dramatics next Thursday.
Yeah, we'll wait and see there. Last week, the provincial premiers, including Danielle Smith, were in Washington on a trade mission, and they ended up securing a meeting at the White House, and the premiers declared it a success. Tyler, do you agree?
Well, to some extent, yes. I mean, it was a success in the sense that they did get a meeting. They certainly met with other people around Washington. They were presenting a united front on the part of the premiers. It was not a success in terms of who they met with. They did secure a White House meeting, but I believe it was with, you know, the Deputy Secretary for Legislative Affairs or something like that. And if you put that in comparison, that same day, Canada's ambassador to Washington met with Howard Lutnick, who's Trump's Commerce Secretary. So, you know, they weren't meeting with a particularly senior official at the White House. It doesn't hurt to get the message out. It doesn't hurt to, you know, build some of those relationships. But and, you know, the outcome of that, of course, was that this official had said that they didn't agree that Canada would not become the 51st state. So, you know, whatever happened sort of in that room, in that meeting, certainly the U.S. is still and U.S. officials are still, you know, sticking to the Trump line on this, broadly speaking. So I don't think any of it has been particularly unsuccessful. You know, Danielle Smith's been down there quite a bit in the last few months, meeting with various people, and she would argue, I think, that she had secured a reduction in the tariff on energy products, because that, of course, was originally going to be 25% all products across the board when it was announced a couple of weeks ago. Trump said, well, 10% on energy, and Danielle Smith certainly tried to take a little bit of credit for that. So I don't think any of it has been unsuccessful, particularly unless you think that there is some sort of problem with the premiers individually or collectively pushing their interests in Washington while the Canadian government, its diplomatic staff, are trying to do the same thing simultaneously. And there is the possibility that those two kind of objectives are at odds. Are they saying the same thing? Is there a consistent message? Are the premiers, you know, offering up, you know, concessions or concerns that the Canadian government would prefer to be kept under wraps, those sorts of things. So it's certainly been it's been very controversial. I mean, Alberta's diplomatic push in the United States, Danielle Smith's diplomatic push in the United States, has been very, very controversial outside of our borders, outside of Alberta's borders, I should say, not Canada's borders. But I don't think I would say it's been, you know, totally unsuccessful.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's never anything wrong with building those face-to-face relationships. And I had heard that Smith actually met with the Interior Secretary, Doug Burton, he's important in the oil and gas industry. So maybe he could be a key influencer down the road. But yeah, never anything wrong with building one-on-one relationships across the border there. Okay, so the Alberta government has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars by auctioning off special hunting licenses in the U.S. Tyler, can you explain what this is all about?
Yes, there's basically a handful of licenses every year that are sort of subject to a ministerial exemption from some of the hunting regulations in Alberta, primarily time of year rules. Like you can't hunt certain animals at certain times of year unless you've got one of these licenses, and so they're auctioned off at sort of conservation hunting kind of conferences in the United States to raise money, and that money then goes to conservation projects here. And so in this case, yeah, there was about $350,000, I think, or $390,000 raised from a series of auctions for some moose licenses. Turkeys were on the list. Deer as well, things like that. And then actually the big one that made a lot of money was $400,000 for a bighorn sheep license. So that was the animal that hunted. This is at a separate auction from the other sort of grouping, but all in, I think raised about $900,000 this year, and that'll go towards conservation. And it does sort of vary by year. You know, it's an auction, depends how much people are willing to pay. Other years have brought in more money, but certainly it's controversial in the sense that the UCP's sort of overall stance on changes in hunting regulations and trapping regulations have been controversial, but otherwise not particularly notable. Other than that's a good chunk of money.
Right. Yeah, no kidding. And the province is still developing its province-wide plan for passenger rail service, but Transportation Minister Devin Dreeshen has hinted there are some interesting policy ideas coming on how to improve transit, especially in rural Alberta. So what are his ideas, Tyler?
Well, we don't know. The government's been pretty tight-lipped about it. You know, one possibility is certainly some sort of bus service to small town in rural Alberta, because of course that has diminished since Greyhound pulled out in 2019, I think it was. And there have been other private operators that have filled that space to some extent, particularly sort of in the, maybe Lethbridge, Calgary, Red Deer, Edmonton, Fort McMurray kind of corridor, Grand Prairie as well. But of course, if you're in some of those other communities, it's a little bit harder to access sort of transit infrastructure. So the rail plan is generally really interesting because there's been a lot of talk over the past 30, 40 years about expanding Alberta's rail network. And there was actually rail service between Edmonton and Calgary at one point. The Dayliner used to run between the two cities until I think 1982 or something like that. But Daniel Smith is quite enthusiastic about the idea of having a rail transport plan all around the province that would, link airports with municipal transit services, that would link other communities with those local transit networks, those sorts of things. So this is not like a short or even medium-term project. This is years, decades, maybe down the road. But it is interesting that there does seem to be renewed enthusiasm for this. As I say, it's been studied a lot and has never really gone anywhere. But there does seem to be an appetite for it at this particular moment. Although, as we just talked about with the budget, who knows what the finances are going to be like down the road to pay for this sort of thing. So it could all be a bit of a pipe dream. I think that's a definite possibility. But it is going to be very interesting to see when they finally come out with this whole plan, what they are actually proposing and how that would, change the way Albertans move around their province.
Okay. Well, this one isn't strictly Alberta politics, but it does deal with pipelines. So we have Liberal leadership candidate Mark Carney, and he's finding himself in some trouble over remarks that he made recently about infrastructure, including pipelines. So while he was speaking in Kelowna, Carney hinted that he would use some ill-defined emergency powers to get infrastructure built. But then he later told a Quebec radio host that he would not do such a thing as impose a pipeline on Quebec. So, Tyler, it seems that he's saying one thing in English and another in French.
That does seem to be the case, yeah. When he was in Kelowna, he talked about using emergency powers, and ill-defined in the sense that we just don't know what emergency powers he's talking about. Is he talking about the Emergencies Act that would somehow allow the federal government to sort of override, say, Indigenous consultation rules? I mean, that seems really unlikely. So a bit unclear what he is talking about or what he even thinks he's talking about. But certainly he talked about the importance of getting some of these infrastructure projects built. And he has expressed support, for example, for an interprovincial pipeline in Canada. But yeah, and then he was speaking to a Quebec radio host and said, no, I would never impose a pipeline on Quebec. And he was pressed on it repeatedly. And he said, no, never, never, never. So well, what is he saying, and did he misspeak in English or did he misspeak in French, or is he hoping that people won't notice, or does he think those are, non-contradictory ideas that you would sort of push forward infrastructure projects, but, not on Quebec? Maybe you push them through in British Columbia, but not Quebec. I don't know. But this certainly got a lot is getting attention in Alberta because, of course, Quebec's intransigence, shall we say, on energy projects was one of the factors that killed the Energy East pipeline. It's one of the factors that has stood in the way of liquid natural gas exports in Quebec, that sort of thing. So all of which is to say, bit unclear what Carney thinks. Certainly Albertans are not wildly impressed by his inconsistency on this topic. So I would imagine he'll be asked about it in the future as reporters seek to get a little bit more clarity on it.
All right. Well, the country has seen a lot of snow lately, and including here in the prairies, and it's hard to believe, but there is actually an upside to the serious snow that Alberta has seen this year. And Tyler, explain what the upside is besides great skiing, of course.
Well, basically just that the ground is going to be wet. The ground will be wet. The forests will be wet. When all of this melts, it's going to be a wet spring. And that means that it's going to be probably a less devastating, less dangerous, less risky wildfire season. And that's what Alberta wildfire officials have been saying. Wildfire season usually starts pretty early officially in the province. And this snowpack is really something that gets us off to a good start to wildfire season. Obviously, the wetter it is, the harder it is for fires to start. And after the Jasper fires, I think the state of the forests and the wetness of the land and the wetlands and things like that is very much a part of what everyone's thinking about.
Yeah, okay. It looks like we're out of time here, but Tyler, thanks so much for joining me once again today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That is legislative correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Well, geography makes us neighbors and trade makes us partners. I'm talking about the relationship between Canada and the United States. Well, to talk more about this increasingly complicated relationship with the U.S. is our foreign affairs correspondent, Lisa Daftari, who joins us from Los Angeles. Lisa, welcome back. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Of course. Okay, so there is so much division right now between Canada and the U.S. Lately over this trade war that could be on the horizon. And it has even reached a point where Canadians and Americans are booing each other's national anthems at sporting events. I can't believe I would have ever lived to see that day. But while Canada has taken steps to improve border security and help repair relations with our country's biggest trading partner, we feel that we've taken the right steps. So why so much animosity from President Donald Trump?
And I'm not here to defend him, but I think what he is attempting to do in his first month in office is to take steps so that the global community and those who are in step with U.S. interests politically and economically can really grow closer together and find even more ways to collaborate. And this is his tough love way of doing that. And again, this is according to him and his advisors, the way that he came in and he put in the tariffs, and already, as you said, the border is more secure. Well, that's one way to do it. For 4 years, we saw, things that were affecting both the United States and Canada. Look, if there are unsecured borders, whether it's our southern border or our northern border, Canada is going to face the detriment for that as well. So, we're talking about national security. We want to keep Canada safe. We want to keep the United States safe. And hopefully going down into Central and South America, we can have more accountability, more vetting, and not allow, drugs to come through, fentanyl to come through. You can have, bad actors come through. How many, hundreds of people coming through our border that have been detected on the FBI's most wanted list or on the FTO, the foreign terror list. And again, those are only the ones that have been detected. How about the ones who got away and have not come under scrutiny yet? So I think these steps, are being taken, but hopefully it will lead to a place where there could be better collaboration in our continent.
Yeah, speaking of collaboration, for the first time ever in history, all of Canada's provincial and territorial premiers met at the same time in Washington, D.C. last week. And of course, the purpose was to discuss the threat of tariffs. And they felt that the meetings were successful, but some think those meetings proved not to be fruitful as our country still faces the threat of tariffs. So how do you, as an American, see it?
This is a very America first, and as it should be, America first, Canada first, Mexico first, France first. If every country would prioritize their national security, would prioritize their economy and the free market to allow that organic economy to grow, to flourish, to have jobs, to have, have imports, have exports, just really thrive, I think we'll be in a better place. And I think that this is something that I hope is contagious. When you have a leader like Donald Trump, love him or hate him, he has shown the world that in only a month, the steps that can be taken to really pivot to this is what will help with our interests. This is what will help keep our border safe. This is what will help with our trade, with our economy, with our gas prices in the long run. So, look, again, there's so much to be said about his approach, but I do think that speaking and putting Donald Trump aside, but speaking just from an aerial view, if you want to talk about what's going on around the world, if you want to look at what's going on in Europe, Europe has completely lost the script. Where is their handle on national security when you have so many stabbings at kindergarten over ideology, over radical ideology, or where you have the economy is abysmal, just tanking. And if you look at so many of the elections across Europe that have been either there have been referendums, there have been a move to the right. This is and my point to wrap it around is to say there's a pendulum swinging here, and that pendulum is swinging more in the direction of common sense, and common sense dictates that we should have a strong economy, that we should have national security, that we should protect our borders. And I hope that we come as more to the center in terms of understanding that this will help everyone across the board.
Do you think the premier's coming to Washington, D.C. was a successful trip?
I do. I think, look, in general, whenever a foreign leader visits the White House, it is a successful trip because in and of itself, it means that there is some sort of discussion happening. There's diplomacy taking place. That conversation, whether it's comfortable, uncomfortable, whether there are agreements or disagreements, there is some sort of coming together. And again, he's only been in office for a month, so we're just getting the ball started. We're getting these conversations going. We're getting, that dialogue going, and I think it's always a good thing to have communication.
Absolutely. Okay, switching gears here. So U.S. and Israeli officials are considering a joint military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. This comes as tensions are escalating in the Middle East. So tell us more about what's happening there, Lisa.
Yeah, so, another day in the Middle East, right? As of October 7th, we've seen this back and forth in a war that is anything but traditional, right? A war is when one side provokes, there's an exchange of shots, and then there's some sort of treaty, some sort of surrender, the war comes to an end. A war of ideology doesn't come to an end. It just continues to spread and to fester. And when you have leaders from the terror group Hamas swearing to have more October 7th again and again and again, it's very difficult to contain this type of ideology and to stop it. It's like playing whack-a-mole, right? So there's no way to stop that. You can stop the funders. You can go to the Islamic Republic and stop the funders, but there's no way to stop this ideology from spreading. With the United States and Israel considering a joint strike on the Islamic Republic, the regime inside Iran, there's no surprise. It's something that is on the table. Maybe they shouldn't discuss it, but we do know that all options are on the table. That is the slap on the wrist to give the regime, the Ayatollah, the message that this is not something that's going to be tolerated. You can't continue supporting, you can't continue funding and training terrorists in the region, whether it's Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. You cannot do this. And putting them on notice by striking their nuclear facilities. The other thing that Donald Trump has sworn is that the Iran regime cannot have a nuclear weapon. Now, over the last couple of years, we have heard various deadlines. They're a week away, they're a month away, they're a year away. Well, we've passed all of those deadlines. So either they are very close to getting a bomb or they have the bomb. And either way, this is not something that we want to risk. So when you have a regime that is this rogue, well, what would help is to set them back in their nuclear weapons program and to deliver the message of deterrence that the new sheriff in the White House will not tolerate this behavior.
And we have officials from Trump's administration who met with Russian officials on Tuesday in Saudi Arabia to discuss ending the war with Ukraine. But Ukraine wasn't invited to this. So why was Ukraine excluded from the meeting, Lisa?
Yeah, a very interesting meeting where Zelensky is very upset that he was excluded from the meeting. Yeah. Putin has said that he was very happy with the meetings, but that not to worry, Ukraine obviously won't be left out of the final say. And how could they? This is a ceasefire, a truce between two sides when one side's missing. Right. I do think this is, again, getting the ball rolling. Putin, not your typical or traditional level-headed leader that you could sit down with and have this, level-headed conversation of common sense. So, I think that the U.S. wanted to take his temperature. They met in Saudi Arabia, completely neutral territory in this sense, not neutral in other ways. But to meet, to get, to feel where he's at, see what they can offer, and then go back to Zelensky. This is what's going on. In the meantime, Zelensky is losing his marbles. He's not very happy about this. He feels like he was left out. The bottom line is we want this very senseless war to end. It's been dragged on forever and ever, and not something that, we'll see. We'll see what the concessions end up being. But I think the United States and Russia want to be in a place where they can go back to Zelensky and say, listen, you don't have many options. They've invaded your country. X percentage, maybe 20% or more of the country is already under Russian control. So here's your best offer, and then to take it from there. And I hope that is something that happens very quickly and decisively, and that Zelensky is on board.
Why would the U.S. be involved in that meeting? And why wouldn't they insist that Ukraine be sitting there at the table with them?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I think that this is something that hasn't happened, right? If it were to happen between the two sides organically, it would have happened already. China came in and said, we think the United States would be a good recommendation for somebody who could broker this. And it's interesting because obviously China would want to be involved, but they're too far embedded in this war, selling weapons to Russia, and they've already involved themselves. They're not somebody who could be that honest broker. So it's got to be, the new Trump administration that comes in. This is something that Trump even campaigned on. He said, I'm going to stop this war. It's not something that, it's something that he thought he could do very easily. So we shall see how easy this is, or if it easily comes about. But just the fact that we have sent representatives to start the conversation, just the fact that Putin has come. Look, Putin is a much harder sell than Zelensky, right? He's the aggressor. He is the madman. So to bring him to the table, I think, is a much more difficult feat. See where he stands and what he wants, and then go back to Zelensky. I think if we brought them both to the table, we might not have been able to get Putin to agree to certain things. So we shall see. I think there's perhaps a method to this madness, and the proof will be in whether or not we have a ceasefire soon.
Yeah, and I think Putin had said that a lot of this depends on the level of trust between Moscow and Washington as well. But meanwhile, we've got Trump, who's sort of denounced Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky as, what did he say? He quoted him as a dictator without elections, and said he had better move fast to secure peace or he won't have a country left. Right. What does Trump mean by this? Is it sort of disrespectful?
Kind of. He's bullying his way to a ceasefire. Yeah. He's basically telling Zelensky, this is what I think of you. You've basically power grabbed your way, to be where you are, which is ironic given the fact that we're dealing with Putin on the other side. But he's basically saying, look, I'm going to belittle you in order to get, you to come around and not really play me like a fiddle the way you did the Biden administration. And that is in the eyes of many lawmakers here in the United States, feeling as though Zelensky really milked the situation. He got a lot of funding that we don't know where that is. This is U.S. taxpayer money, right? How many times did he come to Congress? How many times did he make the petition that he needs more money, more weapons, more this, more that? And then he was given many generous checks. And I think Trump wants to say, we're done. We're done with that. That's not going to happen anymore. You were able to do what you did. You did your power grab, you're still in power, and here's a great offer I'm going to put on the table for you. So I think he's really just setting the stage, really playing his real estate hand. And this is how you cut a deal with someone. You kind of belittle their property and you try to cut a good deal. So I think that's the way he's approaching this right now.
Okay, I'm going to jump, into something else completely here. So there's a British couple, Craig and Lindsay Foreman, who had previously appeared on Britain's Channel 4, a show called A New Life in the Sun program. So they were traveling through Iran on a round-the-world trip when they were detained on espionage charges. And they're being held in prison now. So insiders and campaigners believe that they were arrested simply for being British. So what other details can you provide us, Lisa, about this?
This is entirely from the Mullah's handbook. And that's why you see whenever there is, some sort of hostage taking in Iran itself, it's by the government, and it's always some sort of Western country, and it's always charges of espionage, because that is the basically blanket charge that they could put over anybody. It's kangaroo court, so who's going to prove it? It's just a trumped up charge that means nothing. Why do they do this? They're taking pawns. That's how they flex to the West. If you recall, when they came into office, remember the Iran the hostage crisis, where they took all the members of the embassy and consulate inside Iran, the Americans that were held there. It was between Carter and when Reagan came into office, was able to get them freed, but horrific ordeal that set the tone for this regime that had just come into power after toppling the Shah of Iran. This is something that they do. And they really are in a very weakened and compromised position right now with Trump being in office. He has reinstated the pressure campaign with new sanctions. Obviously, a very different tone than we saw from the Biden White House, that was releasing billions of dollars, that was giving them money for hostages, that was paying the ransom, that was allowing them to sell oil north of $100 billion, that was looking the other way when the regime was selling weapons to North Korea and Russia and China. So I think, things are obviously very different, but it also leaves the Iran regime in a very vulnerable position. So this is what they do when they feel that they are under pressure. So, why were they traveling in such a hostile country anyway?
That's what I wanted to know.
There's a lot of, there's a lot of naivete, especially among people who are these kinds of world travelers that are, well, wow, it'll be fine. Well, no, this is what happens. This is the reality of political Islam in play, and this is a manifestation of that, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. Do some research and pay attention to the countries that you're traveling into, for sure. Lisa, we're out of time here, but thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
That is our foreign affairs correspondent, Lisa Daftari, who joined us from Los Angeles today. I'm Jeanette Roche. On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, thanks so much for watching.